Today's meeting will be a retreading of some of the same ground I did in our last one, but I feel it will be very important. For today I wish to speak of the Camarilla in greater detail, not just their society and how they operate, but also their history and how they came to be, for you can learn a lot from the history of a group. So, as a starting note, I'd like to state on what the Camarilla really is. It is the largest sect of the Kindred kind. The sect is what we call our factions, and it is certainly the most controlling. They treat the world as if it is their own, and they are the monarchs who rule it from the shadows. Most view them as tyrants, and a lot of people say that many of the princes are, but since they have the divine right to rule, it is not my place to say. Oh, you're also going to find that quite a lot of people pronounce it differently. Camarilla, Camarilla, Camarech. There's no correct way to say it, so don't get caught up when someone says it differently. You do also need to keep in mind that some of the members of this organization are older than our language. Some of them have been around since before the correct way of saying words was a thing. Spelling is a very modern conception that most do not know. So of course, no one says it the same way. You need to remember the age of the entities you are dealing with here. So, to begin with the topic of our history. There was a time when we did not rule from the shadows, but were open and controlling of the lesser mortals. The biggest threats to our reign were other supernatural beings that knew well enough to keep to themselves. Of course, in the modern knights, most of them are actually more powerful than us now. Our blood has thinned to the point of dilution. But back then, we were gods amongst the common kind. So what happened, you might wonder? Well, we had been governing all of humanity for countless time. But our collapse was almost simply due to us overreaching. The height of our power, where we were in every facet of their lives, is now known as the Dark Age. And this is primarily because we had to destroy all proof of our rulership to remain anonymous. This is mostly why that age has very little records. It wasn't actually too hard, we've done things like that before. As a side note, I feel like I have to apologize for the burning of the Library of Alexandria. I was mostly responsible for that event, and it is a very long story, I assure you. Our downfall was simply brought about by us overlooking humanity. We began to underestimate them. See, our powers are immense beyond belief, but we are specialized. Some kindred are perfectly suited to take on entire armies of their own, but would be useless in persuading a cat to move a foot. But some of us could muster armies from any group of people just by clapping their hands, but would die to almost anything in a battle scenario. We tend to only be good at the things we specialize in. This results in our weaknesses being able to be exploited by the very beings we governed underfoot. It was the mortals that saw our downfall. I had seen an elder who was twice as powerful as me, who could make your very brain melt by looking into your eyes. And yet he was pelted to death by peasants with slings. I actually laughed when I saw it happen, for I did not truly understand what was happening at the time. We were being hunted down and purged, and all it took to kill an ancient one of our kind was 20 illiterate fucks with bloody rocks. This event is now known as the First Inquisition, and it humbled me, as well as many others of my age, that's for sure. The majority of us were purged, and they targeted the elders, and got most of them in one foul swoop. And to make it all worse, it was mostly our own fault. See, we had been using mortals to hunt our enemies for eternity, yet we were foolish enough not to see that they would start talking to each other, and learn that we are not only all killable, but we have specific weaknesses that can be exploited. They stopped fighting each other in our names and turned the swords on their masters. Those of us who survived were scattered and confused. Our whole society was just uprooted and destroyed before our own eyes. How were we to survive? Well, some of us split apart. Another event began at this time, known as the First Anarch Revolt. A tale for another day. Just know that it is as long as this one, as well as important and interesting. Just know that that event was happening at the same time during all of this chaos. And it lasted for almost 100 years. There was 100 years of complete anarchy and final death. But it was time that we put an end to it. So the surviving elders of almost every European clan had gathered together for one meeting. This was known as the First Convention of Fawns, and a desperate attempt to save our kind. And it was here that the birth of the Camarilla was true. Though we did not use that name at the time, I was honoured to be able to attend that meeting myself. It was there we decided to hide our true power and rule from the shadows, as well as create the various traditions that are oh so important to our organization to this day. And all of the clans were in agreement for this. The Bruja, the Gangrel, Malkavian, Nosferatu, Toreador, Tremere, and of course my own clan of Ventru. But there were two clans who attended but refused the conditions, and stormed out. They were the La Sombra and the Zamitzi, and together they would form a new faction known as the Sabbat. But I will talk about those traitorous bastards another day. There are more events in our history of note, of course, but those don't really matter at the moment. This is our origin, and I hope it teaches you to understand why our rules and traditions are so important, and that we must follow them. For the Sabbat who do not follow them are almost solely responsible for the entity known as the Second Inquisition that has begun killing our kind anew. They are armed and lethal mortal military organizations. Again, a story for another day. Just know to avoid them if you see them. I do think it is time to get into our modern knights and talk about how the Camarilla is organized in greater detail. The ranks, the positions, so and such. So I'll start with the most important rank, and the one that everyone strives for. The Prince. They are the de facto king of a city, with all the roles and powers that would imply. And they are, in almost every regard, a feudal monarch. It is through the prince that all land and rights are given. When accepted into a city, the prince, or someone below them acting on their behalf, will grant you hunting rights. But do not make the mistake of thinking that they are yours to keep. You are a vassal to them, a lesser who serves underneath them, and if you're very unlucky, you'll have someone above you who then answers to the prince, a vassal to a vassal. These things happened all the time back in the feudal era, and we Camarilla have a sort of soft spot for that type of society. The ones directly below the prince are the Primogen. If the prince is a king, the Primogen is a duke, a ruler one step below the prince that answers only to them if at all. There is only ever one Primogen per clan, and their original purpose was to make sure there was clan representation, that all of the clans were indeed doing well and treated fairly within the Camarilla, at least on their city. But over the years, it has become yet another way to climb the ladder of power. See, the Primogens have just as many powers as the prince. If you wish to sire, for example, you will have to go to either the prince or your clan's Primogen. And in some places, you will need permission from both to do so. They also have the ability to call blood hunts, but only really tend to do so on their own clan, as to not overstep their boundaries. It is very rare that they call a blood hunt on a member of another clan, but it can happen. Also, their domains tend to be massive, spanning whole districts that have been given to them by the prince, and in turn, the Primogens give out their districts to their own clan. This is by design, very akin to monarchical feudalism intentionally. Things like this are why it is a very sought-out position, since when there is a power struggle and the prince is missing, it's quite likely that a Primogen, someone with as many people under their command, is likely to become the next prince. But they are not the only one up for the position of taking control after the prince, for the prince has a right hand in the seneschal. They have all the same powers as a prince in the way, and are usually demanding things in the prince's name. The prince must of course elect someone that they can trust fully, and it is for that reason that most of them are the prince's own childer. And it is quite understandable that quite a lot of princes don't actually want a seneschal, for selecting one in many ways is naming your successor, and in turn, naming the dagger that is licking your own throat. They are usually the one that give commands on behalf of the prince's decree, but they are rarely the ones that actually carry them out. That is usually held by the title of sheriff, and you will almost always find them flanking the prince's side. One right hand for rulership, the other for brutality. For you see, it is the sheriff's job to scare people in line and carry out the prince's punishments, so they have to be strong and powerful to make sure they win every fight. In fact, if the sheriff is not the strongest person in the city in a fight, then something has gone horribly wrong. Most sheriffs are indeed side with this purpose in mind, usually by an elder and recruited from military or law enforcement. In fact, I know a lot of Ventrue keep special ghoul task forces, and they are the perfect recruits for this sort of endeavor. But sometimes a sheriff is stretched too thin, and they cannot police an entire domain by themselves, and so they shall appoint hounds. They are given some leeway and treated on a more official lines, but for the most part they are a bloody task force of mercenaries who intimidate and act in blood hunts. Most of the time, however, when there's nothing else to do, they will patrol the set domains they have been given, checking in on the kindred who stake their homes there, making sure they're not getting into too much trouble. If you have broken the Masquerade in any way, it is the hound's job to punish those for their discretions. And if you're lucky, a knock on your door and a warning is what you will get. But do not bank on the kindness of a hound. They're not exactly recruited for their good manners. Also, the Primogens tend to have their own version of a hound, giving them yet more power. These are known as whips, and they do the exact same thing just for their own clan, keeping them in line. But how do they learn this information in the first place? They're not the most apt social gatherers, for that is held by a different title entirely. Harpies are meant to keep tabs on everyone. It is their job to know what has been going on, and who has been doing what. It is their job to keep an eye on you, and inform those, or choose not to inform, the appropriate higher-ups. A lot of people look down on the Harpies and see them as little more than nosy busybodies and spies for their masters. But I say you should remain on the good side of your local Harpies, and hope that next time they overlook your inevitable discretions. And lastly, there is a common rule that we all follow known as an Elysium. This is a place where all kindred are safe to talk and stay. No harm is allowed here, nor any disciplines or powers. No harm is to be done by anyone, to anyone in Elysium, even for those who are blood hunted. They are safe there, until they leave the building, of course. It is one of the few places where a fledgling can talk to an elder, freely and openly. They exist to serve that purpose. If you feel downtrodden or ignored, and your Primogen is not helping, or worse, responsible, the Elysium is the place to go. They could be temporary locations held for just one meeting, or a permanent one. Perhaps the domain of the prince itself is usually a safe place. Regardless, whenever there is an Elysium held, someone is appointed as the keeper of said Elysium. It is a role that makes sure that all are following the rules, and to kick out those that aren't. It is a ceremonial title, a very honoured and well-respected one at that, with little requirements other than a big and private domain. In fact, some might not even own the domain that they are keeping over. They might just hold it in another's stead who's giving them permission. There are rarely more than 3 permanent Elysiums set up at a time, and so these titles are sought after. And even the more permanent ones tend to take breaks every now and again, so that the keeper may rest. But there is always one that is open to all. I hope you see now why the Camarilla are the faction I remain true to, with all the flaws included. For the Masquerade is to be preserved, lest we fall victim to the Second Inquisition. But with all that being said, there is a second option that I am not endorsing, but I'm saying are respectable, though misguided. That is the Anarchs. But more on them another time. Thank you for listening to my tales. I'm the Ashspawn. Feel free to leave a like, comment, or subscribe. It would really mean a lot to me. But, till next we meet, fellow traveller, have a good day.